"Cut tomorrow, Caleb, or I'm buying nothing," Roy Danner snapped, beside 32 acres of drought-burned wheat. Laughter rolled from neighboring farmers, while 17-year-old Caleb Warren stared across brittle stalks. Everyone else had baled for hay. His mother needed cash. October planting bills waited. Still he shook his head. Not yet. Nobody understood why this failing field mattered more than quick money, especially when every grower called it useless. However, beneath those thin heads, the boy noticed something they hadn't. Before we follow what happened next, tell us where you're watching tonight. Subscribe to this channel and stay close, because ridicule was only beginning. Ridicule was only beginning. By noon, 2 more trucks had slowed beside the Warren place, and each driver had looked toward the standing wheat like it was some kind of joke. Caleb kept walking the rows with a paper sack tucked under one arm, pinching heads between his fingers, rubbing kernels free and dropping only certain ones inside. He wasn't saving much, that was the point. Most of the field had suffered badly, just like Roy said. The stalks were short, the leaves pale, and whole patches had gone thin after months without enough rain. Yet every few yards, Caleb found plants that looked different. Their heads were fuller, their kernels were harder, their roots held deeper in the cracked ground. Those were the ones he marked with strips of blue cloth. His mother, Rachel, watched from the porch until she finally came down the lane. "You know Roy's offer disappears tomorrow." "I know. We could use that money." Caleb nodded, because there was no sense pretending otherwise. The repair bill on the grain drill sat unpaid in the kitchen. Fuel had gone on a credit card. Property taxes were due before winter. After his father died 3 years earlier, Rachel had sold 12 acres just to keep the rest of the farm moving. Another bad season could force them to sell more. Still, Caleb held out the sack. These came from Grandpa's old seed. Rachel looked inside. "Wheat is wheat?" "That's what I thought." Weeks earlier, while cleaning the back room of the machine shed, he had found 6 dented metal tins under a workbench. Each carried a year, a field name, and one word written in his grandfather's blocky hand: "Save." 5 tins held almost nothing but dust. The 6th had enough seed for Caleb to plant several narrow test strips beside the newer wheat that spring. He hadn't told anyone. When the drought worsened, the modern variety faded first. Grandpa's wheat didn't look impressive, but it kept filling kernels long after Caleb expected it to quit. He began comparing rows, digging roots, checking heads, and reading the planting notes his grandfather had left in an old ledger. One line stayed with him: "Dry years tell you what seed remembers." Caleb didn't know whether that sentence was wisdom or just an old farmer's habit of writing things down, but he knew what his own hands had shown him. Rachel glanced toward the road, where another neighbor slowed to stare. "So you're risking 32 acres on a few strong plants?" "No," Caleb said quietly. "I'm risking it on what comes after." Her face tightened. A hot wind swept through the field, rattling the dry heads around them. If those kernels failed, Roy's hay money would be gone, and October would arrive with nothing left to sell. And what happens if you're wrong? For once Caleb had nothing to say. Rachel waited beside him, hoping for some confident answer, but the only sound was dry wheat brushing against itself in the wind. Finally, she turned toward the house. "Then you better make sure you're right." The next week made that harder. Every field around the Warren place changed shape. Swathers crawled across the county, laying drought-stunted wheat into rows before balers followed behind. By Friday, Nearly every brown field had been cut low except Caleb's. His 32 acres stood alone beside the road, ragged and thin, impossible to ignore. People noticed. At Miller's Feed and Supply, 2 farmers laughed when Caleb walked in for twine. "Still raising that museum crop?" one asked. Another shook his head. "Boys waiting for Christmas." Caleb paid, tucked the receipt into his pocket, and left without arguing. He had learned something from his grandfather's notes already. A field didn't care who mocked it, neither could he. Still, the jokes followed him home. Roy Danner stopped beside the mailbox one afternoon and leaned through his truck window. "Last chance, Caleb. I can bail what's left tomorrow." "Not yet," Roy sighed. "That answer's getting expensive." This time, Caleb felt it. 3 days of brutal heat arrived after that, with afternoon temperatures climbing high enough to curl leaves tight against the stalks. Caleb checked his marked plants before sunrise and again near dark. Several blue-tagged heads that looked strong a week earlier had begun shrinking. Kernels inside them were soft, narrow, and light. His stomach dropped. For the first time, he wondered whether he had confused survival with strength. If you're watching Caleb hold on to this field while everyone around him says he's wrong, subscribe and stay with the story, because the hardest test is still ahead. Instead of quitting, Caleb changed what he was doing. He stopped judging the field as one crop. Each morning he walked the rows and marked only the strongest surviving pockets. Weak heads were crossed off his map. Better ones were sampled, labeled, and kept separate in small paper bags. A pattern slowly appeared. The best kernels weren't scattered evenly. Most came from the narrow strips planted with seed from one particular tin found beneath his grandfather's bench. Caleb carried those samples into the kitchen that night and spread them beside the old ledger. Rachel looked over his shoulder. "What does that mean?" "I think Grandpa knew which line handled dry years." Caleb turned another page and found a faded note beside a planting date. Before he could read it aloud, the weather radio crackled from the counter. Severe thunderstorms, damaging winds, possible hail. Hail could strip the remaining heads clean in minutes. Wind could flatten what drought had spared. After refusing cash, enduring jokes, and trusting a notebook, he now had no machine, trick, or argument that could protect those rows. For 3 straight days, the forecast kept that threat hanging over the farm. The storms arrived before dawn on the second morning, pushing a black wall over the Warren farm, while Caleb stood under the porch roof and watched the wheat bend almost flat. Rain hammered the yard. Wind ripped loose branches from the cottonwoods. Then hail started, hard enough to bounce white across the steps. Caleb ran out as soon as the worst passed. The field looked beaten. Several acres on the west side were lodged into wet soil, their heads tangled low against the ground. Other stalks had snapped below the grain. Blue cloth markers were scattered everywhere, and some of the strongest plants he had tracked for weeks were simply gone. He walked farther in, boots sinking into mud, until he reached the narrow test strips. Not everything had fallen. The old wheat was bent, bruised and ugly, but much of it was still standing. Caleb knelt and rubbed one head between his palms. The kernels were firm. For the first time since the storm began, he breathed. That afternoon, a retired county extension worker named Martha Bell stopped after hearing about the field from Rachel. She had spent 30 years helping farmers diagnose crop problems and carried the kind of patience that made people explain things properly. Caleb showed her the tins, the ledger, his paper bags, and the surviving strips. Martha listened, then picked through several samples. "You may have something," she said. Caleb almost smiled. She held up one finger. "May." That word landed harder than he expected. Martha explained that grain looking healthy did not prove it would make dependable seed. Storm damage, heat, poor filling, or hidden weakness could leave kernels that appeared fine but failed once planted. "So, how do I know?" "You test it." They set up simple germination checks using damp paper towels, shallow trays, labels, and measured groups from each saved section. Caleb counted every kernel twice. He kept the grandfather line separate from the newer wheat and wrote the date beside each batch. Then he waited. The first tray disappointed him. Too many seeds stayed hard and silent. A second batch did only slightly better. By the third evening, Caleb sat at the kitchen table staring at rows of numbers that made Roy's hay offer feel heavier than ever. Rachel rested a hand on his shoulder. "You can still stop." Caleb looked toward the trays near the window. The strongest grandfather batch had not moved yet. Morning changed that. Small white roots had pushed from dozens of kernels, followed by thin green shoots. Not perfect, not miraculous, but strong enough to make Martha count again when she returned. She checked the percentage, studied the labels, then looked across the damaged field. "Don't sell any of this yet," she said. Caleb frowned. "Why?" Martha closed the ledger. "Because now we find out what it's actually worth. Come October." The first cold mornings brought a different kind of worry across the county. Farmers who had cut drought-hit wheat for hay now needed seed for fall planting, and dealers were running short. Truckloads from farther north were delayed. Prices climbed every few days. Some varieties sold out completely. At Miller's Feed and Supply, the same men who had joked about Caleb's standing field now crowded around the counter, asking when another shipment would arrive. Nobody laughed when the answer was, "Maybe next week." Martha called Rachel before sunrise that Tuesday. "Don't let Caleb leave the farm." By 9, Roy Danner's truck rolled into the yard. He stepped out slowly, hat in hand, and looked toward the damaged field. "Heard you tested that wheat?" Caleb nodded. "Heard it germinated well." "Best lots did." Roy shifted his weight. "I need seed for 80 acres. That was the moment Caleb had imagined through every hot afternoon, every joke, every ruined row. Yet standing there, he didn't feel triumphant. Roy looked tired. Behind him were cattle bills, planting dates, and ground that could not wait forever. Caleb led him into the machine shed. Paper sacks lined one wall, each marked by field section, test result, and harvest date. Martha had helped him separate weak grain from planting stock, and the strongest grandfather line batches had tested better than anything Caleb expected. Roy stared at them. "I thought you were wasting that field." Caleb gave a small shrug. "So did I a couple times." By noon, 2 more farmers arrived, then 4. Word moved faster than any advertisement. Caleb checked what local dealers were charging and could have asked more. Scarcity gave him that chance. Instead, he set a fair price, limited how much each farm could buy, and kept enough back so smaller growers would not be shut out. Rachel watched him write names in a notebook. "You know what that hay offer was worth?" Caleb nodded. She pointed at the figures beside his seed lots. "This is several times that." Money mattered. It covered the grain drill repair, fuel debt, and part of the property tax. More important, each bag meant another neighbor could plant on time, instead of waiting for expensive seed hauled hundreds of miles from soil that had never faced this drought. But the stronger proof came days later. Across the county, drills entered fields, carrying seed from the crop everyone had wanted cut down. Roy returned for his final sacks before sunset. At the shed door, he stopped. "Your granddad teach you this?" "Mostly his notes." Roy looked toward the field. "Wish I'd kept my dad's?" Caleb said nothing. There was still one stack of sacks behind him, untouched. Rachel noticed after Roy drove away. "Why didn't you sell those?" Caleb rested his hand on the top bag. "Because if this seed matters, we can't sell all of it." Rachel studied him for a moment, then looked at the remaining sacks. "You're keeping it?" "Some. Enough to plant again." Caleb had learned the lesson the hard way. Selling every kernel during a shortage might bring quick money, but it would leave them depending on somebody else next season. His grandfather had saved seed for a reason, not because old ways were sacred, because each dry year, storm and harvest, taught the farm something worth carrying forward. So Caleb set aside the strongest lots. He planted part of them on the Warren ground and gave smaller measured batches to two young farmers who promised to track what happened. Martha helped them record planting dates, rainfall, emergence, and winter survival. Nothing about it felt grand. It was careful, slow work, and every bag carried a question into winter. Would this line keep proving itself when conditions changed? It was the kind of answer nobody noticed until years later. Roy came back one evening after planting finished. This time, he brought a cardboard box instead of an empty trailer. "My dad's records," he said. Caleb opened the lid. Inside were notebooks, seed tags, rainfall totals, and faded field maps going back decades. "Thought they were junk," Roy admitted. "Maybe I was wrong twice this year." Caleb smiled. "Could be useful." Roy nodded toward the ledger on the bench. "You made me look." That mattered more than the apology. Soon, other farmers started digging through sheds, cabinets, and old desks for notes their fathers and grandfathers had kept. Most records held nothing special. Some were outdated. A few contained details about soils, seed, pests, and weather that nobody had bothered to read in years. Caleb never claimed the past knew everything. He had simply proved it was foolish to throw knowledge away before understanding it. The seed money paid the overdue drill repair, cleared their fuel balance, covered the property tax, and gave Rachel enough breathing room to keep every remaining acre. No land sale. For the first time in 3 years, the Warren farm entered winter without a notice sitting unpaid on the kitchen counter. Caleb kept writing. He recorded the drought, the hail damage, germination results, which rows survived, what failed, and where the strongest seed came from. Beneath his grandfather's handwriting, a new set of notes slowly filled the page. By late fall, green lines began rising across several neighboring fields. Roy's place showed them first, followed by Miller's South Ground, and finally the Warren farm. Caleb walked beside those fresh rows one cold evening, rubbing soil between his fingers as Rachel followed behind. Winter was closing in. Months earlier, everyone had seen worthless wheat. Now the county saw seed. Rachel looked toward the remaining dry stalks and smiled. "So," she asked, "what do we do with that field now?" Caleb finally grinned. "Now we can cut what's left. Some fields are harvested for grain. Others leave behind something more valuable, proof that patience, observation, and old knowledge still matter." Caleb saved more than wheat that year. He saved a future his family nearly lost. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, and we'll meet again along country roads.